First of all, thank you very much for your introduction, Anna. It's a pleasure to be here to present, well, a sort of a sketch on Robert Smithson, his relationship with the cinema and especially the Spiral Jetty film. These are just a few images of the film that I find particularly striking and interesting to think about his thoughts on film, and I start by reading two quotes from Robert Smithson himself. So the first goes: "The Earth's surface and the figments of the mind have a way of disintegrating into discrete regions of art." And the other is: "And the movie editor, bending over such a chaos of takes, resembles a paleontologist sorting out glimpses of a world not yet together, a land that has yet to come to completion, a span of time unfinished, a spaceless limbo on some spiral reels." So these quotes are, to my mind, clear about the ideas that Smitson held about cinema, the movie-going experience, and the construction of the earthwork Spiral Jetty, which resides in the Great Salt Lake in Utah, and the film Spiral Jetty as well. So Smitson thought of the film and the earthwork as independent artistic objects, and I take this as an opportunity to think about the film as a film work in an expanded sense. And hopefully I will clarify this by the end of my presentation, and also to think about this film, The Spiral Jetty, as something more than the mere documentation of the construction of the jetty. So cinema was a way for Smitson to work out the grand narrative of matter, addition, sedimentation, and history, which seemed to be at the forefront of his thinking, allied with a sort of mythical dimension, but without the messianic in a Benjaminian sense. Cinema seems to be, for Smitson, a technique based on a set of operations that require devices, and the eye of the camera is a favorite figure for Smitson, and the parallel with Zigo Vertov could be perhaps inserted here, which allows for the ordering of the chaos that nature has become, dispersed fragments of destruction and construction that cinema can give an order to, however free or not narrative in an Aristotelian sense. Robert Smithson was a prolific writer, and his texts, in which we find a strong taste for metaphor, allow us to locate certain concepts and themes that inform his work and the relationship with what Smithson considered the cinematic state of the real, decomposable and captured by the camera, whose creative potential could be brought forth through montage. Creative potential being here synonymous with the demonstration of temporalities that coexist in matter and its transformation in its translation into moving images. Smithson's expanded cinema is a cinema that beckons contemporary practices of the structural film, quoting Michael Snow's Wavelength from 1967 at the end of this film, The Spiral Jetty, when zooming in on a photograph of the jetty. Snow's film ends with a photograph of the sea, ending an inexorable long zoom that crosses the space of an apartment. Smitson compared this image of an inexhaustible sea to the infinite flow of the film camera, but did not share the same practice as Snow's. So cinema was a construction, a survey of the obscurities of matter, a technical procedure that returned in another cinematic form, the cinematic found on the surface of the real. He reports in a text called A Tour of the Monuments of Passaic, New Jersey of 1967, "Noonday sunshine cinema-ized the sight, turning the bridge and the river into an overexposed picture. Photographing it with my Instamatic 400 was like photographing a photograph. The sun became a monstrous light bulb that projected a detached series of stills through my Instamatic into my eye." So Robert Smithson's Spiral Jetty, 1970, was a complex project that comprised the creation of the earthwork, the jetty in the Great Salt Lake, the eponymous film, a text that Smitson wrote around the production and filming experience of the Spiral Jetty, and the creation of an underground cinema, because it would be located in an underground cave and would only project the film of its own construction. Robert Smithson participated in the debates of modernism and minimalism, structuralism, and the group of artists of land and conceptual art. But his project reflected contemporary debates about the unprecedented dissemination of the image and the dilution of the boundary that separated art from life, from a truly original place of reflection on the implications of art and cinema in this context, and also in the context of his work. Smitson's relationship with cinema is evident, not only because he produced films, but because he was also a regular moviegoer, and we often find comparisons, references, notes on cinema in his writings. This relationship seems to be based on one hand on a materialistic conception of cinema, in the sense that the camera was considered a technique for the artist, and on the other, the possibility that cinema offers for articulating and bringing into reflection the various temporalities that Smitson situated in the mutability of matter and the way it produces a certain psychoanalytic inscription of the image in the viewer. Smitson did not disregard the effects that cinema can produce on the viewer. The terror of access for Smitson would be a spectator left to the laziness of watching films. The infinite succession of images would finally produce a blur, like a stain. But how to, in the context of an extended experimentation with the moving image that enters the gallery space, to which Smitson was part of, classify Robert Smithson's expanded cinema? What interested Smitson was cutting, assembling, rearranging images and movements in order to deconstruct space and affix time to strata. In Smitson, cinema is not what he called rationalism, that is naturalism, but rather a relationship with matter in the material sense, which is the profilmic event, a geological space that Smitson considered to have a transitive relationship with cinema, and that, because the archaeological markers of the Jetty film are the past and the future, brings to the screen any space, whatever. It is not a question then in Smitson of thinking about the cinematographic device as a combinatory, as a device with the ability to cluster different elements together, but of thinking about temporalities and the inscription that matter can make in a film and vice versa. This may be an imaginative leap, but one that seems pertinent. In Smitson's film practice, there is a transposition of the dialectical conception of sight, non-sight. Generally speaking, the sight is the place from which something is subtracted that is then placed on the non-sight, thus responding to an addition principle. The non-sight contains the sight and refers to it, and vice versa. So the big becomes small, the small becomes big. The film Spiral Jetty works as an equivalent to the sculpture, and the sculpture works as an equivalent to the film. The metaphors used by Smitson are captivating in this sense. The approach to a place, to a landscape, as a cinematic space made of light and sound, capable of being cut out by the camera and reorganized, realigned by the montage. Art historian George Baker sees in the dialectic sight-non-sight the development of a cinema model, as he calls it, that derives from Smitson's interest in cinema's representation strategies. The dialectic of sight and non-sight and the decomposition and recomposition of frames of the film Spiral Jetty in an art magazine, which the artist published in 1974, are synonymous with a model of cinema from which art can be thought. It is the exploration of the relational potential of cinema that Baker sees updated in the film Spiral Jetty, which makes cinema the epitome of a logic of the vector, or Deleuzian escape lines, which make up a plane of immanence from which the association of images makes use of the logic of the interstice of the cut that does not obey a logic of continuity, that is not synonymous with an indivisible space and linear time, but with an expansion of the invisible in matter to a logic of time and movement that can only be revealed by cinema. From the cinema model and the potential for connectivity in the chaos of nature, one can perceive the concomitances and temporal overlaps in the film Spiral Jetty, which Andrew Urowski points out as being close to the Deleuzian crystal image, summoning Chris Marquer's La Jetée as a direct and exemplary antecedent to defend what he perceives as the stratigraphic temporality of Smitson's film. The Spiral Jetty, like Chris Marker's film, can be interpreted as a dystopian narrative, a time travel, a fiction. The film's narrative shows us the construction of the jetty as a geological image of the land that Smitson brought to the immanence of the world, tells us the history of the land and takes us on a journey. Arriving at the site of the jetty through the film means going back in time, making a mnemonic trip. Smitson's film is the antithesis of Marker's perfect closed crystal. Rather, it prevents closing. For Urowski, the film operates a decentering of the viewer, destabilizes the spatial coordinates, displacing the subjectivation processes that cinema can operate, underlining a decentered, fundamentally entropic temporality that seems to insist that time cannot be considered a function of the subject, but is rather the subject that comes to be always and only through its temporalization. And I'm quoting Urowski here. So it was the stratigraphic image, which Deleuze understood as an image because of its ability to archive geological time, to encompass Henri Bergson's concept of duration, of the past always contained in the present, past and present at the same time. And this is something that Smitson complicates because he sees inscribed in the temporality of images and things the signs of the future, since he considers that the construction process begins with ruin, from where the monuments, the works or structures that Smitson captured with his cameras came to be. This future is different from the one advocated by Jean Youngblood. Smitson refers to Youngblood explicitly in the text A Cinematic Utopia, writing that it is easy to imagine a cinema produced, made exclusively by computers. Smitson, on the contrary, works with an iconography and an imaginary that refers to the past, with the reference to dinosaurs, caves, etc., that you saw in the film. In the ruined New Jersey landscape, looking at the rubble of abandoned works, Smitson stresses that the ruins are the sign of a potential yet to be realized. They are ruins in reverse. Nothing was created from there. To analyze the Spiral Jetty from concepts of cinematic temporality and historical time is a captivating reading. Smitson's cinema was an archaeozoic medium, which should be understood as more than a simple translation of Smitson's interest in matter and geological time, but rather the underlining of a condition of the analog in cinema. The film and the work are transitive and concatenate all temporalities. Present, past, and future are all together. Smitson's approach is not teleological. There is a tension that prevents the work from closing. I think I'm running out of time. Perhaps
just a bit. Are you going to conclude soon?
Yes, I'm going
to. You can continue.
Okay, thank you. Smithson's scale and our positioning depend on our attentions to the actualities of perception, a cinematic state of the real. Smithson to consider that matter is a vibration, which when perceived becomes a physiological reaction, a spasm, a torpor. The shots of the sun, of its incandescence, seem to be the cinematic translation of this idea, a spot of light which disorients. This perception and consciousness of a world that has become a series of fixed images seems to bring Smitson closer to Deleuze's postulate of the world-made image. This claim derives from Deleuze's analysis of Bergson. So for Bergson, the universe is a set of images which exist independently of our perception of them, that is, they are themselves matter. So Eric Alliez mentions that in Deleuze, consciousness or perception is no longer consciousness of something, rather there is the affirmation of a plane of immanence where the Deleuzean becoming transforms cinema into a meta-cinema. The universe becomes itself cinema. But in Smitson, there is no total dissociation between the cinematic space of the real and the space of the Deleuzean crystal image. The movement that unites the image is not false or completely dissociative. It is not a pure time image. In Deleuze, and I'm almost concluding, in Deleuze, the production of any space whatever, as he proposes in his film books, marks the production of a space that does not correspond to a vertical horizontal reading of the screen, but to a decomposable space whose axes vary. This is not only indicative of the mobility of the camera as a production of non-theological perception of time, which precedes and projects the historical dimension of the events represented on the screen, the variations in scale, the decomposable space, from the start already cinematic, the affectation of the senses due to the vibrations of matter that cinema can translate, the cut, which causes spatial indeterminacy and rejects coordinates, puts in motion what is under the surface of matter, thus creating temporal stratigraphies, and place Robert Smithson at this point of transition between the image, the time image and the movement image, and the production of an unexpanded any space, whatever. So I'll cut here. Thank you very much. Sorry for going over time.